Therefore, rid yourselves of all malice and all deceit, hypocrisy, envy, and slander of every kind. Like newborn babies, crave pure spiritual milk, so that by it you may grow up in your salvation, now that you have tasted that the Lord is good. As you come to him, the living stone, rejected by humans but chosen by God and precious to him, you also, like living stones, are being built into a spiritual house to be a holy priesthood, offering spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. For in Scripture, it says, "See, I lay a stone in Zion, a chosen and precious cornerstone, and the one who trusts in him will never be put to shame. Now to you who believe, this stone is precious, but to those who do not believe, the stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone, and a stone that causes people to stumble, and a rock that makes them fall. They stumble because they disobey the message, which is also what they were destined for. But you are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's special possession, that you may declare the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his wonderful light. Once you were not a people, but now you are the people of God. Once you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy."
Good morning. I have a question for you this morning. It's summertime. What's your favorite ice cream?
Chocolate, mint chip.
All kinds of things. Those aren't cupcakes. It's actually kinds of ice cream up there. Delicious. If I was forced to make a choice,
Closer, it looks like hard serve ice cream.
yeah, okay, yeah, you can see it. If I was forced to make a choice, I would probably say that my favorite thing, because you can only get it at certain times of the year, is chocolate frozen custard. I just love it. Anyway, now here's a different kind of question. What's your favorite tool? You've got a favorite tool that they like to use?
Someone said a screwdriver.
A screwdriver, okay. Anything else? Okay, a couple things. Not as much of a. All right, saw. All right. Not as much enthusiasm for tools. Since I'm not a skilled craftsman, if you put me in a corner, I'd say that my favorite tool is probably a maul. Great on demolition, not so good on construction. Anyway, it's kind of an interesting question, because if you had to build something, I wouldn't ask you what your favorite tool was, right? I would say, what tool do you need to use? If your favorite tool was a drill, but you were using nails, drill wouldn't do you any good, right? If your favorite tool was a hammer, but you needed to cut some boards, not so useful, right? How about if you love duct tape, but you needed to fix a leaky roof? Well, you'd probably still use duct tape. Some people use duct tape for everything, right? But you get the idea, though. Most of the time we think of choosing in terms of preference, like ice cream. But God chooses a person according to who will work the best in the right situation, like a tool. And that's our focus for Scripture from 1 Peter. In our series this summer on 1 Peter, we're looking at this letter to help us understand three questions. The first question is, who are we? Who are we as Christians? The second question is, as Christians, what kind of people shall we be? And the third question, which we're not going to look at today, but we're going to look at eventually, is what happens when the values of our dual citizenships clash with one another. Last week we talked about how we have two citizenships. We have a citizenship that belongs to whatever country we live in on earth, but we also have a citizenship, a permanent citizenship in heaven. And sometimes the values of those two citizenships clash. And so we're gonna try to figure out what to do with that. It's kind of an interesting question in this election season, isn't it? Well, we kind of handle the questions in reverse this morning. What kind of people shall we be? Because the first part of our second chapter really is more of a conclusion to chapter 1. These are Peter's concluding thoughts on that idea of Christian holiness, which if you were here last week, to be holy, I said, is to love better. Sometimes we think about the word holiness and we think about the word, we think self-righteousness, or we think holier than thou, right? But to be holy actually means to love better. God's holy love is a love supreme, as John Coltrane entitled an entire album after. It's a supreme kind of love. And how do we achieve that kind of love? As you might imagine, it's not automatic. It takes some work to come around to God's way of thinking about love. Peter says this in 1 Peter 2, verses 1 through 3. He says, "Therefore rid yourselves of all malice and all deceit, hypocrisy, envy, and slander of every kind. Like newborn babies, crave pure spiritual milk, so that by it you may grow up in your salvation, now that you have tasted that the Lord is good." In other words, if you want to discover the kind of love that God has for you, and if you want to pass that kind of love on to other people, then you've got to clean all the bad stuff out. If you look at that list, malice, deceit, hypocrisy, envy, slander, these are the kind of weapons that we use against each other, aren't they? If we want to hurt somebody, these are probably some of the things that come up. These are the things that are on full display in our political campaigns. It gets downright nasty because it appeals to the nasty side of what it means to be a human being. Because politics is really what? It's a popularity contest. It's a popularity contest like no other. It's not about the quality of a person's ideas. It's about who gets the majority of the votes. But God's love, God's holy love, is not about winning a popularity contest. Because through Christ, we've already won. It doesn't matter how popular or unpopular we are. It's really about building people up. The things that Peter lists are poisons that we find in relationships. They're antithetical to holy love. We can't have these things in this list that he has and be practitioners of holy love too. These things will trip us up. They'll hurt our relationships, and they'll get in the way of building up the church the way it should be. See, once we catch on to holy love, once we experience it for ourselves, once we begin to practice it little by little, Peter says, crave spiritual milk. You need that to grow. Once you clean the bad stuff out, you need more of the good stuff. And it comes and fits and starts. We're all in the process of growing. None of us has arrived. But once we start to practice that and experience that, we begin to make ourselves ready for use as tools for God's purposes. And that's where our passage heads next, to our identity in holy love. And that's the definition of what the church is to be all about. First, Peter says we're two things in our passage this morning. He says, first, we're living stones. Take a look, starting with verse 4 with me. He says, as you come to him, the living stone, rejected by humans but chosen by God and precious to him, you also, like living stones, are being built into a spiritual house, to be a holy priesthood, offering spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. For in Scripture it says, "See, I lay a stone in Zion, a chosen and precious cornerstone, and the one who trusts him shall never be put to shame." Now to you who believe, this stone is precious. But to those who do not believe, the stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone, and a stone that causes people to stumble, and a rock that makes them fall. They stumble because they disobey the message, which is also what they were destined for. Now Peter describes the church as a spiritual house, with Jesus as the cornerstone. In the church, I want to clear this up, because every time I read this passage, you know what song plays in my head? Anybody want to take any guesses? It's going to take somebody under a certain age to get the right answer. But in the church, you're not just another brick in the wall. Does that help you? I know that Pink Floyd once sang a song about the dangers of conformity. And when we conform ourselves to culture, when we conform ourselves to counterfeit gospels, then there is a danger in doing that. I think we can see pretty clearly where those dangers lie. But I mean, there's not a lot of good out there that you want to be conformed to completely. And likewise, in matters of faith and religion, if you conform yourself to anyone and to anything other than Jesus Christ, then you're going to be in trouble. I mean, if you try to conform yourself to me, you will definitely be in trouble. That would be a disaster. I mean, I'm working on it, but I'm more like you than...
We're all human.
That's right. Thank you. When we conform to the image of Christ, think of holy love here. God builds us into the church as living stones. We're not bricks in a wall, we're living stones built into the church. Think about a stone wall built without mortar. Or think about that stone arch that you see up there. That's built without any mortar at all. They just built it together with stones that fit perfectly. And the capstone in the center, or the keystone, that's a very important stone, isn't it? And if you don't have the right capstone, the arch falls in on itself. All the other stones can be made to fit. But you need to start right, and you need to finish right. Jesus is our cornerstone. And Jesus is the capstone, or the keystone, of our spiritual house. In Greek, which is the original language of the New Testament, you can translate the word cornerstone as capstone or keystone as well. So Peter could have an image of a wall in mind, or he could have an image of an arch in mind. We're not sure. But when we understand that, when we understand where Jesus belongs in the big picture, the beginning and the end, things will go well for us. But if we take Jesus out of the picture, it's like taking the keystone out of that arch. What will happen? It'll just fall in on itself. Everything falls to the ground eventually. So first, Peter says we're living stones built up into the church by God through holy love. Secondly, Peter says we're a chosen people. Look at verse 9 with me. But you are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's special possession, that you may declare the praises of Him who called you out of darkness and into His wonderful light. Once you were not a people, but now you are the people of God. Once you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy. It's an echo of ancient Israel there, but a spiritual inheritance instead of a physical inheritance with land. Think again of the idea of ice cream versus tools. You know, one of the things that Jesus encountered in His ministry was that people began to think that being chosen by God was some sort of a prestige thing. We're God's favorite because we're chosen. Look how awesome I am. I'm chosen by God. Give me that tiara and bouquet of flowers, right? I'm the winner, and since you're not chosen, you're the loser. That was one of the ways that the Jews of the first century were able to keep their heads held high, even though they were a conquered people. The Romans weren't chosen by God. Therefore, the Romans ultimately were losers. But that's not what being chosen by God is all about. God chooses each person. We're all of us, chosen by God. There's not a person here who is not chosen by God. I want to tell you that this morning. If you're here this morning, and even if you're not here this morning, well, I'm speaking to you, so you're here. But if you're hearing this message, you're chosen by God this morning. But chosen for a reason. Not because you're God's favorite. You're not God's favorite ice cream. You're a tool on God's tool wall. You're here for a purpose. God has created you, and ultimately God is the one who gives your life meaning and purpose. That's why the idea of calling is so important. What has God called you to do with your life? How do you fit into the spiritual house that God is building? Well, it's really not up to the people in the pews. It's not up to me. It's really up to God. I mean, you can't answer that question unless you spend some time with God. Unless you give some thought and some prayer to that question. You know, all kinds of people go to church. And all kinds of people go to church for all different kinds of reasons. But not everyone in church knows why they're there. Or knows how they fit there. Only God can answer that question. I mean, I can help you. The people around you can help you with that question. But if you're going to have any kind of conviction about what your calling is, what you're here to do, then you've got to hear it from God yourself. You've got to have that experience. And you know you've heard from God because it'll be a natural fit. You know, God is building a house out of living stones, and if you look at back at that arch, those stones fit perfectly together because a master builder has come along and knows exactly how to build that arch or build that wall together perfectly without using any mortar. That's what calling from God feels like. It fits perfectly. You fit with everything else that's going around in the church. Being chosen by God is not about prestige. It's about purpose. Purpose, not prestige. There's a lot more that we could say about that. I could spend 2 or 3 hours talking about that, but you know, you've got things to do today, and I got to go to another church. So I'll be talking more about that at some point, I'm sure. But let me sum up the passage this way. If we're following Jesus together, if we're growing closer together as people, Jesus draws us together, carefully choosing where we fit best. We're a nation within a nation. We have 2 citizenships, an earthly citizenship and a heavenly citizenship. But we've been chosen by God, chosen to love and to bless people. St. James is here to be a blessing to the city of Niagara Falls and to our community. That's what we're here for. Whether it's ancient Israel or the United States of America, our final and lasting citizenship is in heaven. So no matter what kind of earthly trouble we face, the church is always a reminder of who we are and what kind of people we're supposed to be.